The city of New York sparkled under a blanket of freshly fallen snow. It was Christmas morning, but the usual festive cheer seemed muted in the freezing air. Sarah Jennings strode briskly down the icy sidewalk, her heels clicking against the frost-covered concrete. Her phone was glued to her ear, her free hand clutching a steaming cup of coffee that she barely sipped. Her schedule was packed, her mind racing with deadlines and meetings that wouldn't pause for the holiday. Christmas was just another day for Sarah, a nuisance wrapped in tinsel and tradition. As she rounded the corner of 56th and Park, her attention was caught by a soft whimper. A small dog stood at the curb, its scruffy fur matted with patches of snow. It was trembling violently, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thin coat of fur. The dog's dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her hesitate, if only for a moment. Sarah frowned. "I don't have time for this," she muttered under her breath, pulling her coat tighter around her. She sidestepped the dog, ignoring the way it craned its neck to watch her as she passed. The faint jingling of a Salvation Army bell mingled with Christmas carols playing from a nearby storefront, but none of it reached Sarah's hardened heart. The dog trailed her for a block, keeping a careful distance but never breaking its gaze. She glanced over her shoulder and sighed in frustration. "Shoo!" she called out, waving her hand dismissively. The dog froze, then tilted its head as if considering her command. A pang of guilt flickered in her chest, but she shook it off. "Someone else will help you," she said aloud, more to herself than to the animal. The streets were quieter than usual, the typical hustle and bustle subdued by the holiday. Small clusters of families strolled past, bundled in scarves and laughing as they carried bags of last-minute gifts. Sarah envied their leisure, though she would never admit it. Her world didn't allow for such indulgences. Work came first, always. At the corner cafe where Sarah was scheduled to meet a client, she glanced back once more. The dog was gone. She didn't know why that made her stomach twist. Brushing the thought away, she pushed open the door and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. She ordered an espresso and settled into a corner booth, spreading her laptop and documents across the table like a shield. Her client arrived shortly after, and they launched into a heated discussion about quarterly projections. The dog and its pleading eyes faded into the back of her mind. When the meeting ended, Sarah stepped back into the cold with a renewed sense of purpose. She had made progress, secured a deal, and was already mentally drafting an email to her boss. But the air felt sharper now, the biting wind cutting through her coat. The festive decorations lining the streets seemed garish, almost mocking in their cheerfulness. She turned down a narrow side street, hoping to cut a few minutes off her walk to the subway. The snow was deeper here, crunching loudly beneath her boots. As she approached an intersection, a chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. And then she saw it. The dog was back, standing in the middle of the crosswalk. It stared at her, unmoving, as if waiting for her to catch up. "You again," she muttered, irritation creeping into her voice. But something about the dog's posture made her pause. It didn't seem lost or aimless. It seemed deliberate, purposeful. The way it stood in the middle of the street, blocking her path, was almost intentional. Sarah shook her head, dismissing the thought. "I must be imagining things," she said, stepping off the curb. The dog barked sharply, a sound that echoed in the stillness of the empty street. She stopped in her tracks, startled. The dog barked again, louder this time, and moved to block her way entirely. "What's your problem?" she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended. But the dog didn't budge. It barked once more, then tilted its head toward the street. Sarah followed its gaze and froze. A black sedan barreled down the icy road, its tires skidding slightly as it sped through the red light. The car roared past, missing the crosswalk by mere seconds. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the realization washed over her. If she had stepped forward, she would have been directly in its path. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her breath visible in the frosty air. The dog had saved her. There was no other way to interpret it. It had stopped her from stepping into danger, from making a fatal mistake. Slowly, she looked down at the scruffy animal, who now sat calmly at her feet, wagging its tail as if nothing had happened. For the first time all day, Sarah's phone was forgotten. The world around her seemed to slow, the noise and chaos fading into silence. She crouched down, her knees sinking into the snow, and hesitantly extended a hand toward the dog. You saved me," she whispered, her voice cracking. The dog licked her hand, its eyes warm and forgiving. It didn't care that she had ignored it earlier, that she had dismissed it as unimportant. In that moment, the walls Sarah had so carefully built around herself began to crack. Something unfamiliar bloomed in her chest, something that felt suspiciously like gratitude. "I guess I owe you one," she said softly. The dog barked in agreement, and for the first time in years, Sarah smiled. She didn't realize it yet, but that moment was the beginning of a transformation she couldn't have anticipated. One that would reshape her understanding of love, generosity, and the true meaning of Christmas. The snow continued to fall gently as Sarah found herself walking back toward her apartment, her unexpected savior padding quietly by her side. She glanced down at the dog, whose fur was still matted and dirty, but whose tail wagged with relentless enthusiasm. She had tried shooing it away again, even crossing to the opposite side of the street at one point, but the dog wouldn't leave her. Every time she looked into its dark, soulful eyes, she felt the nagging sting of guilt. "This is ridiculous," Sarah muttered as she fumbled for her keys outside her building. The dog sat patiently at her feet, snow collecting on its scruffy head. "Fine, you can come in, but only for tonight," she relented, pulling the door open. The dog trotted inside without hesitation, as if it belonged there. Sarah rolled her eyes, locking the door behind her. She lived in a sleek, modern apartment that reflected her personality, practical, efficient, and devoid of unnecessary clutter. The dog looked comically out of place, sniffing curiously at the cold, gray tile floors. "Let's get one thing straight," Sarah said, toeing off her snow-soaked boots. "This isn't permanent. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to a shelter." The dog looked up at her, wagging its tail in what she could only interpret as defiance. She grabbed an old towel from the bathroom and started drying the dog's fur. "You smell awful," she complained, wrinkling her nose. The dog didn't seem to mind her grumbling, leaning into her touch as if it had been starved of affection for years. Despite herself, Sarah found the act oddly soothing. After rummaging through her pantry, Sarah managed to find a can of tuna and poured it into a bowl. "It's not exactly gourmet," she said, setting the bowl on the floor. The dog devoured it in seconds, then looked up at her expectantly. "That's all you're getting," she added firmly, though her tone lacked conviction. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself unable to focus on her usual routine. The dog, now sprawled contentedly on her living room rug, had an unsettling effect on her carefully curated solitude. She tried returning to her laptop, answering emails, and organizing her calendar, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the day. The way the dog had stopped her in the street, the near miss with the speeding car. Finally, she gave up, shutting her laptop with a sigh. "I guess you need a name," she said aloud, glancing at the dog. It perked up at the sound of her voice. "How about Max? You look like a Mac." The dog barked softly, as if in agreement. Sarah chuckled, surprising herself with the sound. It had been years since she'd laughed at something so simple. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of paws clicking against the hardwood floor. Max was circling near the front door, his tail wagging with excitement. "What's gotten into you?" she asked groggily, rubbing her eyes. He barked and nudged the leash she had hastily fashioned from an old scarf. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. But the dog's expectant gaze left her no choice. Bundling up against the cold, she clipped the makeshift leash to his collar and led him outside. The city was just waking up, the streets quieter than usual. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but notice the way Max seemed to brighten the world around him. Strangers smiled as they passed, some even stopping to comment on how cute he was. Sarah, who was used to navigating the city unnoticed, found herself engaging in small talk with people she'd normally ignore. At the park, Max's energy was infectious. He bounded through the snow, his joy so pure that Sarah felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in years: happiness. She laughed as he pounced on a snowbank, his paws disappearing into the fluffy white powder. For the first time in a long while, her phone stayed in her pocket. Later that day, Sarah called several local shelters, hoping to find a place for Max. Each time, the answer was the same. No room. We're full, one shelter worker explained apologetically. It's been a rough winter, and we've had an influx of strays. With every call, Sarah's resolve weakened. By the fifth rejection, she realized she wasn't as upset as she thought she'd be. Max, meanwhile, lay curled up at her feet, his contentment radiating warmth throughout the apartment. That evening, Sarah caught herself Googling best dog food brands and how to bathe a dog at home. The realization hit her like a freight train. She was beginning to care about Max. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Over the next few days, Max became an integral part of Sarah's life. He was there to greet her when she returned from work, his tail wagging so furiously it seemed ready to fall off. He followed her from room to room, a silent but reassuring presence. Max's loyalty was unwavering, and Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before. One night, as she sat on the couch with a glass of wine, she spoke to him as though he could understand her. "You know," she began, "I didn't even want you here. But now, I can't imagine coming home to an empty apartment again." Max thumped his tail in response, and Sarah smiled. Despite their growing bond, Sarah still struggled with the idea of keeping him permanently. She told herself it was impractical, that her life was too busy for a dog. Yet, every time she thought about taking him to a shelter, her chest tightened with an unfamiliar ache. One evening, while walking Max, Sarah encountered a woman with a golden retriever. They exchanged polite nods, but as their dogs sniffed each other, the woman struck up a conversation. "Your dog is adorable," she said. "How long have you had him?" "Oh, he's not mine," Sarah replied quickly, though the words felt hollow. "I'm just helping him out for now." The woman smiled knowingly. "Funny how they have a way of choosing us, isn't it?" Sarah didn't respond, but the comment stayed with her. By the end of the week, Sarah found herself buying a proper leash and collar for Max. As she fitted the collar around his neck, she realized she wasn't just making him a part of her home. She was making him a part of her life. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare her. Winter in New York grew harsher as the days passed, blanketing the city in an unrelenting chill. Sarah's routine had shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Max, now a fixture in her life, had brought changes she hadn't expected, some of them inconvenient, others unexpectedly heartwarming. Still, Sarah couldn't help but feel conflicted. Though she enjoyed Max's company, his presence forced her to confront aspects of her life she'd long ignored. Each morning, as she tugged on her boots and wrapped herself in scarves for Max's walk, she found herself thinking less about the emails waiting on her laptop and more about the quiet beauty of the snow-covered city. It was unsettling how much one scruffy dog had disrupted her meticulously organized world. One particularly frigid morning, as Sarah trudged through the park with Max at her side, her phone buzzed incessantly in her coat pocket. Ignoring it had become harder. The pile of work she'd neglected in favor of Max's needs was mounting. The stress was creeping back, threatening to undo the calm she'd begun to rediscover. "Come on, Max," she said impatiently, tugging on the leash as he sniffed a particularly interesting patch of snow. "We don't have all day." Max looked up at her, his tail wagging despite her sharp tone. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. Sarah sighed, feeling a pang of guilt. She crouched down, scratching behind his ears. "Sorry," she murmured. "I've just got so much to do." Max leaned into her touch, his eyes soft and forgiving. Sarah couldn't help but smile. "You're too good for me," she said quietly. That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call from her boss, Roger. "Sarah," he began in his usual brusque tone, "I need you to take point on the Hansen account. They're one of our biggest clients, and they're getting jittery. Can you meet with them tomorrow?" Sarah hesitated. The Hansen account was notorious for its impossible demands. She could already feel the pressure squeezing her chest. "Tomorrow?" she asked, glancing at Max, who was sprawled on the rug, gnawing on a chew toy she'd bought him. "I'm not sure if—" "This is a big opportunity, Sarah," Roger interrupted. "It could mean a lot for your career." The word career hit her like a slap. Her life before Max had revolved around that single word. It had defined her choices, her priorities, her identity. She glanced at Max again. He looked up, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice tinged with reluctance. The following day, Sarah left Max alone in the apartment for the first time since he'd come into her life. She hated the thought of him waiting for her in an empty space, but the Hansen meeting demanded her full attention. As she hurried out the door, she promised herself she'd make it up to him later. The meeting was as grueling as she'd expected. The clients were demanding and impatient, and Roger's constant hovering only added to her stress. By the time she left the office, it was dark, and the biting wind seemed to pierce right through her coat. When she finally returned home, Max greeted her with unbridled excitement, his tail wagging so hard it seemed to move his entire body. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Hey, buddy," she said, crouching down to hug him. "I missed you too." But as she stood, she noticed something. The corner of her sofa had been shredded, the stuffing spilling out like snow. Nearby, one of her favorite shoes lay chewed and ruined. "Max!" she exclaimed, her voice sharper than she intended. Max's ears drooped, and he slunk to the corner of the room, his tail tucked between his legs. Sarah sighed, the weight of the day crashing down on her all at once. "I can't do this," she muttered, sinking onto the mangled sofa. "I can't balance work and you." Max watched her from the corner, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. For a moment, Sarah considered calling one of the shelters again, convincing herself that this arrangement was unsustainable. But as she looked at Max, something inside her softened. The next day, Sarah decided to work from home. She rearranged her schedule, pushing less critical meetings to the following week. As the hours passed, she noticed something surprising. She was more focused. With Max curled up at her feet, she felt less of the usual frantic urgency that often accompanied her work. When she took a break to walk him in the afternoon, she realized how much she appreciated the fresh air and sunlight. Simple things she rarely made time for before. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. Later that week, Sarah received a call from a colleague, Laura. "Hey Sarah," Laura began. "I was wondering if you'd like to join us for the holiday food drive on Saturday. We could really use the help." Sarah almost declined out of habit, but something stopped her. She thought of Max, of the way he had given her a second chance at finding meaning beyond her work. "Sure," she said, surprising herself. "I'd love to." On Saturday, Sarah and Max joined the food drive, delivering care packages to families in need. It was Max who stole the show, charming children and adults alike with his wagging tail and friendly demeanor. Sarah watched as he brought smiles to faces that had been marked with weariness, and she felt a sense of pride she couldn't quite explain. One little girl, no more than 6 years old, approached Sarah timidly. "Is he yours?" she asked, pointing at Max. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "He's mine." The words felt both foreign and natural, like something she'd always meant to say but hadn't realized until that moment. That night, as Sarah and Max returned home, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. Her apartment, once sterile and cold, now felt warm and alive. Max lay on the rug, his eyes half closed, and Sarah sat beside him, stroking his fur. "You've changed everything, you know that?" she said. Max didn't respond, but she knew he understood. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to believe that life wasn't just about climbing ladders and meeting deadlines. It was about connection, about finding joy in unexpected places, even in the wag of a dog's tail. But life had a way of testing newfound clarity, and Sarah's journey with Max was far from over. The wind howled fiercely as another snowstorm swept through the city, blanketing New York in a thick layer of white. Sarah sat by the window of her apartment, a steaming cup of tea in hand, watching the flakes swirl in the glow of the streetlights below. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her slippered foot, his contentment a sharp contrast to the storm outside. Life with Max had become surprisingly natural. Sarah no longer thought of him as a disruption, but as a companion who had filled a void she didn't know existed. Yet, deep down, she wondered if her newfound sense of balance and purpose could withstand the pressures of her old life. It felt precarious, as though the peace Max brought her could be swept away as easily as snow in the wind. The peace was shattered the next morning when Sarah's phone buzzed with a string of urgent messages from her boss. Roger's sharp tone practically bled through the screen. Emergency meeting. Hansen contract is unraveling. Be here. Sarah's stomach twisted. The Hansen account had become her responsibility, and if the contract fell apart, the fallout could damage her career irreparably. She stared at the message, torn between her professional instincts and the guilt gnawing at her. Max looked up at her, sensing her unease. I don't have a choice, she whispered, pulling on her coat. Max followed her to the door, his tail wagging hesitantly, as if asking to come along. Not this time, Max, she said softly, scratching behind his ears. I'll be back soon. The meeting was a nightmare. The clients were angry, threatening to pull their business unless immediate changes were made. Roger barked orders and assigned tasks, his frustration palpable. Sarah worked tirelessly, her mind a whirlwind of strategies and damage control. Hours passed before she realized she hadn't eaten, let alone checked on Max. She glanced at the time, nearly 8 p.m. Guilt surged through her as she pictured him alone in the apartment, waiting for her. I'll finish this from home, she told Roger, ignoring his glare as she packed her things. As she stepped out into the night, the storm had worsened. Snow whipped through the air, stinging her cheeks as she rushed to the subway. Her phone buzzed again. A weather alert warning residents to stay indoors. The storm was expected to intensify, with temperatures dropping dangerously low. By the time Sarah reached her building, her fingers were numb, and her breath came in short, icy puffs. She fumbled with her keys, finally pushing the door open. Max, she called, shaking the snow from her coat. Silence. Her heart sank as she scanned the apartment. Max wasn't in his usual spot by the rug. His leash was still by the door, untouched. But the small window in the kitchen was ajar, snowflakes dusting the sill. Panic set in. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and rushed outside, her heart pounding. Max, she called into the storm, her voice swallowed by the howling wind. The streets were eerily empty, the snow piling high and masking any tracks he might have left. She felt helpless, the cold biting through her layers as she searched alleyways and side streets. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had he gotten lost? Hurt? She refused to let herself think the worst. He's smart, she muttered aloud. He'll find his way back. He always does. But as the night wore on, hope began to waver. Finally, as she turned down a narrow street, her flashlight caught a familiar shape huddled against a dumpster. Max, she cried, relief flooding her as she rushed toward him. He was trembling, his fur caked with snow and ice. His eyes lit up at the sound of her voice, but he didn't move, his body too weak from the cold. Oh, Max, she whispered, wrapping him in her scarf. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled him, her guilt overwhelming. I'm so sorry. I should never have left you. She carried him back to the apartment, her arms aching but her resolve unshaken. Once inside, she bundled him in blankets and sat by his side, rubbing his fur to warm him. He looked up at her with tired but trusting eyes, and she knew she couldn't fail him again. The next morning, Max was still weak but improving. Sarah had spent the night researching ways to help him recover, from homemade broths to keeping him warm. She called the vet as soon as they opened, making an appointment to ensure he was okay. As she sat beside him, stroking his fur, she realized how much he had come to mean to her. He wasn't just a dog. He was her family. The thought terrified and comforted her all at once. Over the following weeks, Sarah made changes that shocked even herself. She began delegating more at work, carving out time for Max and for herself. She started volunteering at the shelter that had initially turned her away, inspired by Max's resilience and the joy he brought to others. Her colleagues noticed the difference. You seem happier, Laura remarked one day. Sarah smiled, thinking of Max waiting for her at home. "I think I am," she replied. As Christmas approached again, Sarah found herself preparing for a holiday she'd once ignored. She decorated her apartment with lights and garlands, even setting up a small tree. Max watched curiously as she hung ornaments, his tail wagging at the twinkling lights. On Christmas morning, Sarah and Max delivered care packages to families in need, just as they had the year before. This time, Sarah didn't feel like an outsider trying to do good. She felt part of something bigger, something meaningful. Max, as always, was the star of the day, bringing smiles and laughter wherever he went. That night, as they sat by the fire, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in a year. Max lay with his head on her lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just that day on the street. You saved me from myself." Max thumped his tail once, as if to say he understood. For the first time, Sarah felt at peace. She had found joy in the simplest moments, love in the most unexpected place. Max had taught her what she had been too busy to see, that life wasn't about perfection or ambition, but about connection, kindness, and the quiet moments that made it all worthwhile. And as the snow fell gently outside, Sarah knew she would never spend another Christmas alone. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.